the Nintendo Switch 2 has just released, on the day that I scheduled this video to publish. The console announcements have stirred up quite the controversy and disdain towards Nintendo across the internet. If you watched any of the Nintendo Treehouse presentations shortly after the reveal presentation, chances are you saw walls of text chanting, "Drop the prices," like some sort of incantation. The recent controversies have led to a great deal of misinformation being promoted as fact, even by bigger names and creators I have a lot of respect for. One of the biggest regards of which being to the prices. Has Nintendo's greed gone too far? Is the question many seem to be asking without having all the information. Now that the console is out, that is the goal of today's video, to give you all the information to the best of my ability to help unpack the economics of it all and clear up any misconceptions. Full disclosure, I am no economics expert. I'm a computing science major with a specialization in game design. Gaming is my field. In regards to overhead costs, Nintendo keeps their cards very close to their chest. Very little is public information. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the only people that truly know how much this is costing Nintendo is Nintendo. Oh, and I guess maybe that one person who works at Nintendo's nephew. I did try my best to unpack and understand as someone not versed in an economic background, and with little public information to go off of. But if somebody has more accurate explanations or sources, please let me know and I'll be sure to include it in the pinned comment below. So, what's even going on with those game prices? For the sake of this video, I'll be talking about the prices from the frame of reference of the USA. Though, for full disclosure, I actually live in Canada. I think that there are some important questions to answer here. First, are video games actually becoming more expensive in terms of buying power? And secondly, are video games becoming more difficult to afford? These seem at first like they'd be the same question, but they're not. After unpacking those two questions that I assume are somewhere where I'm pointing, we'll also delve into what are the actual factors behind these prices. So let's begin by addressing that first question. Are video games actually becoming more expensive? To start off, we need to drop the F-bomb, inflation. Currencies will typically be losing their value over time due to the effects of inflation to varying degrees, but it's not uncommon to think inflation is usually only small amounts over a long time. At least I would imagine it's not uncommon to think that because that's what I thought until I did research for this video. That does seem to be the case where it's relatively smallish changes over time, but during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a massive spike in inflation that has led to a much larger shift in dollar value than normal in this past half a decade.
So, let's take a look at this chart right here. This chart right here is the amount of money, this is basically the amount of money that the government's printing. And then right around the pandemic, it spiked at a level never before seen, and now it's at all-time colossal, crazy banana bears high.
Admittedly, we don't have enough of a dataset yet to determine what Nintendo considers to be a standard game price. Doug Bowser himself said that for this console they're adopting variable pricing based on the game, something they experimented with games such as the more expensive Tears of the Kingdom or the cheaper Mario vs. Donkey Kong. On the Switch 2, we see that Donkey Kong Bonanza is $70 USD, and Mario Kart World is $80 USD. For simplicity, full disclosure, if I say dollars, I'm going to be referring to USD. If I'm referring to other currencies, such as these guys, then I'll specifically say I'm doing so. I just put my money back in my wallet so I can continue making the video. If I had to guess, I would wager most of their games will end up being $70, and their console seller titles like Mario Kart, Smash Bros., 3D Zelda, the next 3D Mario, and potentially mainline Pokemon will end up being $80. To compare accurately to past prices, according to usinflationcalculator.com, $60 US in 2017 is equal to $78.28 at the time of calculating for this video in late April 2025. Comparatively speaking, a brand new Switch 2 game on launch in 2025 is more expensive than a brand new Switch 1 game on launch in 2017 by less than $2. So while at $80, Mario Kart World at launch will be a couple dollars more expensive than a $60 Switch 1 game at launch, if the 2017 $60 is getting approximately $2 more expensive per year, then I think it's a fair assumption that an $80 Switch 2 game in 2026 will actually be about the same comparative cost as a $60 Switch 1 game in 2017. And in 2027 onward, that $80 Switch 2 game will actually be cheaper comparatively to Switch 1 games on launch. Meanwhile, if the standard game is $70, that is actually significantly cheaper than Nintendo's historical averages at launch when we account for inflation. fully understand the scope of this price difference, we need to go further back. According to this article by 33rd Square, NES games were under variable pricing, with many games being $40 and many larger games like Super Mario or Legend of Zelda being up to $50. Let's say $35 is about the average benchmark for a higher quality game, so we're not cherry picking extremes. The NES released nationwide in North America in 1986. $35 in 1986 shoved into the inflation calculator is $102.13 today. That's a decent jump more expensive than an $80 Switch 2 game. The price Ubisoft would charge you today to play a game 3 days early. Fast forward to 2006. The Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 are now out, and have made the $60 price point for video games the new industry standard. For reference, $60 USD in 2006 today is $95.18. I guess those Xbox 360 and PS3 games were much more expensive than our Switch 2 games today. At the time, Nintendo kept their games cheaper, at $50, or $79.82 today. So if you bought a game like Mario Kart Wii, it would be nearly the same comparative price as Mario Kart World today. This is the price that Iwata intended to stand firm on throughout the life of the Wii, while the industry competition prices increased around them. By 2012, with the launch of the Wii U, we saw Nintendo adopt the new $60 standard. If you were to buy New Super Mario Bros. U for $60 in 2012, the equivalent value it would cost today would be $83.57. This is a standard price they maintained through the Wii U and through the Switch era as well. Let's say you bought a new Switch game in 2024 for $60 like, say, Unicorn Overlord. Terrible name, fantastic game. That same item in 2024's USD directly converted to 2012 USD would actually be $42.91. That is about $20 cheaper than you bought that Wii U game for. So despite you paying $60 for both games in 2012 and 2024, that game you bought in 2024 for $60 is actually about $20 cheaper in terms of modern buying power. So while prices have been staying the same number, yes, the actual buying power cost to the consumer has been drastically decreasing when accounting for inflation, meaning generated revenue has also been drastically decreasing, assuming that production costs didn't majorly decrease along the way somehow. This standard $60 has been maintained by Nintendo for the past 13 years in the US, despite the US dollar losing seemingly roughly 30% of its value in that time. The Nintendo Switch 2 is the first of the big three's console releases in a post-COVID-19 pandemic world, where we saw many currencies take a massive hit. My home country of Canada had an inflation surge of 8.1% in June 2022, marking a 40-year high. The European Union reached rates of 11.5% in October 2022, after pandemic-induced supply issues and the hike in energy prices due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If you're curious about the total change in Nintendo's video game prices in the US per home console, here's the standard game prices I could find online, which I have calculated to account for relative inflation in this chart. As you can see, prices have actually been going down up until the Wii, where they've since hovered right around the mark of $80 equivalent value today. When we dip under that $80 mark in today's value, the next console has seen a price hike that gets us just above that yet. If you're buying a game like Donkey Kong Bonanza for $70 USD, that is actually the cheapest a new full-price Nintendo game has been on console launch ever. Inflation can sometimes mean that while the number price of an item deceptively gets higher, it may mask the truth that the actual cost of the item may be getting lower. Oh, and to clarify, I had to re-record some things here. I don't want to give you the impression that I randomly change shirts in the middle of the day. So to answer the question of if video games are getting more expensive, well, no. In terms of buying power, at $80 USD, the price is actually essentially unchanged, and at $70, Nintendo games are actually cheaper than they've ever been. Again, at the beginning of a new console release, to clarify. But what about that second question? Are video games becoming more difficult to afford? Because it's not as cut and dry as simply, oh, the value of the dollar has changed, therefore it's cheaper on consumers. Let's say in 2017 you had $10,000 stored away in savings. It earned no interest, and you didn't spend a penny. By 2025, you still have $10,000 stored away. Even though the 2017 $60 and 2025 $80 buying power is almost the same, obviously that 2025 $80 is going to bite into a larger chunk of your savings. The number on your savings stayed the same, but it lost value. It now costs more from it to buy the same thing if products have prices adjusted to account for inflation. Take my truck, for example. When it was manufactured in 1953, its MSRP was 1,344 Canadian dollars. In 1953, I could go out and buy a new truck like this for that amount. But if I instead kept that $1,344, investing nothing so it remains static, and today, in 2025, wanted to buy a new vehicle with that amount I saved from 70 years ago, well, unreasonable might be an understatement. Maybe I could buy an electric kitty car or two. Inflation means that if prices are adjusted to account for it so the producer earns the same amount of revenue, it does eat into a bigger chunk of existing consumer savings. But how much are consumers actually earning today? By metrics provided by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, we can see annual median income per full-time worker in the US by week. We only have data for Q1 2025 so far, so for consistency's sake, I'm going to make a chart of median weekly income per year based off of the first quarter for that respective year. We're going back to 2012 to cover the span of the most recent 3 consoles, Wii U, Switch, and Switch 2. Keep in mind, the data represent earnings before taxes and other deductions and include any overtime pay, commissions, or tips received. If we now calculate the cost of a full-price Nintendo game as a percentage of weekly earnings in the launch year of the Wii U, Switch, and Switch 2, we find the following. It would seem by median weekly income, games are actually cheaper comparatively. Wii U to Switch saw a decrease of 0.86%, and Switch to $80 Switch 2 saw a slight decrease of 0.28%, and Switch to $70 Switch 2 saw a larger decrease of 1.12%. In regards to median income, we've had a jump of games getting cheaper from Wii U to Switch, and from Switch to Switch 2. And at a $70 price point for standard games, despite it being $10 more expensive on paper, it is actually an even bigger, cheaper jump from Switch to Switch 2 than we saw from the Wii U to Switch in terms of median income consumers are earning. Even when you account for the fact that the price went up this time when it stayed the same across Wii U and Switch. Despite wages generally increasing over time, remember, with inflation, the actual buying power of that dollar does change over time. If we look at median usual weekly real earnings, aka we're already accounting for inflation here, we see that from 2019 to 2025, we haven't actually changed that much. We have this massive spike in the middle from COVID, which fell back to the pre-COVID levels in the years following, which we have been gradually moving up from. If we compare just 2012, 2017, and 2025 though, we do see increases in real earnings. So, to recap in terms of inflation, if producers want to earn the same, not in terms of the raw number, but in terms of buying power, they need to increase their prices to account for the difference inflation makes. Consumers are generally earning more income, and the cost of a video game is becoming a smaller percentage of those earnings, which would at first seem to imply that video games are becoming cheaper when it doesn't cost as much of earnings. However, existing savings, if not earning interest or earning on investments, will not grow with inflation, and therefore be losing its value, causing video games to be more expensive on existing consumer savings. But it's still far more complex than that, because we're not accounting for living expenses. Sure, people are generally earning more money, but if they need to be spending more money just to get by, then there's less expendable income to spend on luxuries such as video games. This is where things get weird and more difficult to understand, because most probably aren't going to be living and handling living expenses alone. You may have a significant other, roommate, or other family who are contributing, and your living expenses are going to be more expensive if you have dependents you're looking after. So the math isn't quite as easy as just subtracting individual living expenses from median individual income. So I don't think that this is something that we can get a definitive answer on the affordability of, but we can identify some general trends in the cost of living. A 2021 study by the National Low Income Housing Coalition found that affording a modest 2-bedroom home affordably, being defined as needing 30% or less of a person's income, would require earning at least $24.90 per hour, which is more than 3.4 times the federal minimum wage, while for a 1-bedroom home, that hourly earning needs to be at least $20.40. According to a study by Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies in 2023, rising housing costs, coupled with pandemic-era income losses, produced the most significant drop in housing affordability in years, as seen in the most recent census data. Between 2019 and 2021, the number of cost-burdened renters, defined as those spending more than 30% of their income on housing, increased by 1.2 million to a record 21.6 million households.
In 1975, the average home in the U.S. cost $42,600, or $244,700 when adjusted with 2024 inflation rates. In 2024, however, the average home cost just over $512,000. And if you're looking in major metro areas where top universities and booming job markets are supposed to offer better opportunities, the prices are even worse.
Housing costs have been increasing drastically. Here in my home country of Canada, it is no understatement that we are in the middle of a housing crisis, with many my age wondering if they'll ever even be able to afford a home. In regards to the cost of groceries, according to Human Progress, using information from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and prices on Walmart's website, on the large timescale of 100 years from 1919 to 2019, the time price, aka how many hours of work you need to put in for the same amount of goods, has been drastically decreasing. 27.26 hours of work in 1919 needed to purchase a basket of 42 food items only requires 3.85 hours of work in 2019 for the same basket of 42 food items. However, that 2019 abundance of food has not carried into 2024, where now that same 42 food items in the basket costs 4.45 hours. In other words, because of inflation between 2019 and 2024, US blue-collar workers need to work an extra 36 minutes to buy the same kind and quantity of foods that they bought in 2019. So while generally over time food prices have been going down, the past half a decade we've still been recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic and governmental response to it, and as such have generally been seeing an increase in prices lately. Prices not just for groceries, but also vehicles, energy, and luxuries are also projected to increase not just in the US, but across the world due to current US economic policy towards tariffs. Despite now being frequently in economic headlines, tariffs are not a brand new created thing by the second Trump administration. In reality, they are not so uncommon, and they are typically done strategically. Perhaps you want to put some tariffs on China to either incentivize producers to increase domestic production within your own country, or to negotiate deals with other countries who can provide said product. It's not reasonable to be able to do everything domestically, but you can impose strategic tariffs to increase certain domestic production, or to work out new trade deals with other nations who now have opportunity to be more competitive in your market and giving consumers more choice. What is not strategic is to tariff everybody based on trade deficits. I couldn't figure out a good way to visualize this, so I'm doing it in Minecraft. Let's say I own a bakery. I'm used to looking over there because that's normally where my camera is set up. Let's say I own a bakery, and I go to the grocery store to buy goods that I need in baking, like milk, and just pretend that milk is here or something. I don't have any emeralds. They are so noisy. I dug up my emeralds. Let's say I trade them for goods that I need for my grocery store, like pretend that this is milk, or I'm some sort of weird cursed bakery that uses cooked chicken recipes. I am now at a trade deficit with the grocery store. I have bought some of their goods, but they are not buying my goods. That does not inherently mean that I should tariff the grocery store because of this trade deficit. For one, it's just not really realistic to expect them to be purchasing my goods in return. And the reason why I am purchasing from them is because it is cheaper than opening my own farm and doing it all myself. What am I going to do? Get my own like milk, butter, and flour and everything that I need? That is going to be significantly more expensive and somehow more noisy. How did sheep get in here? Than just going and purchasing from the grocery store. In regards to new trade deals, when you impose tariffs on one nation, it will often be to create greater opportunity and a more competitive environment for other nations to get involved in your market. Got a worse deal for these guys, so others now have a better deal. If you're suddenly cutting everyone a worse deal, you now have a world that is figuring out how they can start excluding the US in their trade agreements and start working with each other more, even across countries that have had long withstanding disdain for one another like China, South Korea, and Japan. So, not only are prices going to increase in the US, as foreign countries now have to pay much more for importing those same goods, but prices will increase in many nations across the world as they figure out how to start cutting the US out of the deal and start working out more agreements with one another instead. Plus, even if you're not getting goods from the US, if those goods need to go through the US, like Nintendo based goods would have to for us here in Canada, you are still eating that tariff. Who this is going to hurt the most are US consumers and US producers that rely on exports to foreign countries that are increasingly losing interest in US made products. In my home country of Canada, while I had noticed consumer preference for Canadian products where possible, for example, if a product is made in Canada, that will often be a large part of its marketing. Nowadays, I'm seeing that to a whole new level. Grocery stores in Canada have begun placing maple leaf labels next to products produced in Canada, so that as consumers grow continually disinterested in US products, it becomes easier to recognize Canadian products at a glance to support. As foreign countries continue seeking opportunities to support domestic or other foreign products, US exporters will continue to make less revenue, and unfortunately, the ones who are going to feel this the most are going to be small businesses, even if they're not relying on exports, because now it is getting so much more expensive to import the things they need, and the countries that they want to export to are looking for ways to cut them out. Here in Canada, we'll be feeling it in key ways such as the vehicle market, where I now frequently see vehicle ads including pre-tariff pricing as one of their key marketing points. We'll return to tariffs when we discuss the actual production costs of the Switch 2, but for now, the main point is that it is a contributing factor to the increased cost of living. Increased cost of living also means you're generally going to want higher education to get into better paying jobs. According to a Statista study in 2019, about 1/3 of the North American workforce were in positions that required higher education. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, in 1980, the price to attend 4-year college full-time, including tuition, fees, room and board, $10,231, and that's already adjusted for inflation. But by 2019 to 2020, that price rose to $28,775. For myself, I began university in 2017 and graduated last year, 2024. It took me a little bit longer than most as I was doing a major with a double minor and a certificate alongside it, while at the same time I was bouncing across a couple different institutions and some things transferred and some things didn't, and it was a mess. And then there was dealing with COVID in the middle of my university studies as well, and that definitely didn't make things any easier. In 2017 when I began, I was paying around $600 per class I enrolled in. In 2024, when I graduated, I was paying about $1,000 per class. So that's $10,000 for a full year of 10 classes. Thanks, UCP. I was beginning to think university was getting too easy to afford anyway. Rising costs have been putting pressure on millennials and Gen Z, and soon enough, Gen Alpha, to pursue post-secondary education to be able to stand out in a competitive job market and pursue higher paying jobs. But now that school is so expensive, many need to take out student loans in order to even be able to afford their education, leaving them with a net worth in the red they'll need to pay a significant portion of their lives towards just paying off.
All right, average Gen Z net worth by age. Okay, here we go. Let's start with the class of 2022 at age 23. That would be negative $31,571. Okay, class of 2021, age 24. That would be negative $23,773.
Alright, you get the point. I'd say we're at another checkpoint in the video here, so let's do another brief recap of what we just went over. As a reminder, are the costs of games actually increasing when we account for inflation?
No.
But are games getting more difficult to afford? I would argue, generally speaking, for the generations I would think would be most interested in the Switch and its games, being Millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha. Yeah. Of course, this is going to vary greatly based on individual circumstances. It's not like there's a single right answer about if the affordability is increasing or decreasing for everyone. And I'm not enough of an economics or statistics whiz to be able to comprehensively determine median living expenses by calculating it based on public use microdata. which, if I was, I would be able to subtract from the Bureau of Labor Statistics records on median income to determine expendable income, which I could then calculate Switch 2 games as a percentage of to see if it's a bigger chunk of expendable income to be more fair, as opposed to as a percentage of income before living expenses like I did before. But I've never studied economics, and I took introductory statistics in like my first year of university. I'm not qualified to crunch these numbers. So my best guess, emphasis on the fact that this is an estimate, is yes. While comparatively cheaper when accounting for inflation, video games are getting more difficult to afford. However, this isn't an exclusive trend to video games. In terms of general cost of goods, we look to the Consumer Price Index, which is defined by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics as a measure of the average change over time in the prices paid by urban consumers for a market basket of consumer goods and services. As we can see, everything's been going up in the States, especially in the early 2020s with the COVID-19 pandemic. When everything goes up, luxuries are typically going to be taking the biggest hit. Video games are a luxury. It stands to reason in regards to the change in buying power because of inflation and the change in consumer price index over time, which itself correlates with inflation, that the standard $60 Nintendo established in 2012 would not hold as such. Not everything can be as legendarily unmoving as the Costco hot dog. Everything is going up, which can also mean that it becomes more difficult to afford goods such as video games, comparatively speaking. This transitions us into the third question to help us get a more full picture of what's going on here. What are the factors behind the price increases? We just discussed inflation and the cost of rising goods generally, but what specifically about Switch 2 makes it more expensive to produce? A good point to begin analyzing that question is to examine the Japanese yen, since Nintendo is a Japan-based company. Switch consoles seem to be produced in Vietnam. Cartridges, unclear, probably either Japan or Vietnam, and packaging seems to be handled in key packaging facilities for different regions, such as Washington State for the Americas in this town I've never heard of before. Nintendo has historically produced in China, which they began shifting away from since at least 2019 to avoid growing tariffs countries have on China, and it's not entirely clear how much they still produce in China, but I still think it's worth examining. If we compare the value of the Japanese yen to the Vietnamese dong, Chinese yuan, and US dollar, we find the yen has been drastically losing buying power. It is costing more and more yen to purchase the same amount of these foreign currencies, which drives up the costs of their foreign production. If an item costs 10,000 dong in both 2012 and 2025, that item in 2012 would cost 39 yen, but in 2025 would cost 56 yen. If you're a Japan-based company producing in Vietnam, China, or the US, chances are that production is getting significantly more expensive. It's also worth noting if we're comparing to competition such as Xbox and Sony, cartridges are significantly more expensive to produce than disc counterparts. The exact production cost on Switch cartridges is not publicly available information, but it's understood that there exists a significant production cost increase on cartridges, especially as we increase the data sizes, as we'll likely be seeing more of with Switch 2 titles that are getting bigger. It's why we see some games available across multiple platforms cost more on Nintendo Switch physically, such as with Rockstar's LA Noire, where you can purchase it for other consoles for cheaper. Blu-ray discs have been available almost 2 decades now. It is incredibly efficient at this point to produce them cheap and fast en masse. We also can't forget we're operating on more powerful hardware. Games are getting bigger and more technically proficient, so the games themselves are most likely getting more expensive to create compared to Switch 1. It's also worth discussing expected sales. I don't think the Switch 2 will be a failure by any means. I'll just bump my microphone there. It sold out of pre-orders immediately, but I just can't imagine it performing as well as the Switch 1. The Nintendo Switch was the mainstream introduction of a new concept, home console handheld hybrid. You can play on your TV and continue playing seamlessly on the go as you take the entire portable console with you. It was a truly novel idea, and in a market where they held supreme control over the handheld market, but were struggling against competitors in the home console market. It made sense to embrace the field they had a near monopoly on. It released without competition. You want a handheld console? You were going Nintendo. It had been out by several years by the time the COVID pandemic rolled in. meaning the consoles were truly available at this point in time and not being scalped to all hell, and you had consumers stuck at home wanting something they can casually lounge around and enjoy rather than needing to be rooted to a TV setup. You had games like Animal Crossing New Horizons that released at the most perfect time, when the world needed it the most, and it became a much larger success than I think anybody expected, as players enjoyed being stuck at home while they played a game about going out and casually enjoying basic activities and social interactions with their neighbors. I would argue the Nintendo Switch was lightning in a bottle you're not recapturing. You no longer have the benefit of releasing a console without competition, and at the perfect time for the world to go into lockdown. At least I hope they don't have that benefit this time. Nowadays, competitors have tried their own take on the formula, some with great success, such as the Steam Deck, some with major failure, like the Google Stadia. If people want at-home and on-the-go gaming, they now have similar alternatives. The Switch also had way more games and especially way more third-party support than the Wii U did. Plus, almost every major first-party Wii U game just came to the Switch anyway. The Switch 2 is back compatible, unless you're a diehard Labo fan. You can pick one up and enjoy cheaper Switch 1 games just fine, because there's no shortage in that library. So maybe you buy a Switch 2 for better performance in your Switch 1 games, because I swear Xenoblade X is darn near unplayable on my day 1 Switch. Who cares about an ongoing invasion and is trying to evacuate? This frame rate, I swear I'm playing Pokemon Scarlet and Violet half the time. And for access to that vast library of Switch 1 games. But if you decide you want to pick up a Switch 2 game from time to time, you can. The Switch will probably continue to have games put onto it from third parties and indie studios. Maybe Nintendo sometimes too, considering they continued releasing 3DS games years after the Switch had been out. Or maybe they don't want to make that mistake again. I'd argue 3DS games released in 2018 or 2019 didn't garner much interest because you need to dust off a different console that isn't the latest thing. But because of back compatibility where you can still play new Switch releases on the Switch 2, there may be more interest. Take Pokemon Conquest, for example, which... I put it away. Here we go. Here. Take Pokemon Conquest, for example. Let's not trip as I come back here. Where right on the back of the game case, it says, also playable on Nintendo 3DS. If your game doesn't need the extra oomph of the Switch 2, why not just make it available on both consoles? You could get a Switch Lite for a much cheaper price and just enjoy on-the-go indie gaming. Maybe you can finally play Silksong. There simply does not exist as much reason to purchase a Switch 2 as there did to purchase a Switch 1. So I have a hard time envisioning a timeline where the Switch 2 can rival the Switch 1 in sales. Less consoles being sold also naturally means less games being sold. This means that to achieve the same amount of total game sales on the Switch 2 as Switch 1, Nintendo would have to invest in developing more games. It takes more development investment and more games produced to achieve the same number of sales as previously. Or maybe I'll be surprised and be wrong on that. And adding on to all those additional expenses, we need to return to the economic policies of America's favorite felon and how they directly impact the production of Nintendo hardware. Trump's made no secret his intent to impose tariffs and reshape US economic policy. Before he was even elected, he made clear he wanted the 10% baseline for everybody, sorry penguins, but would establish much higher tariffs on countries such as China that are, quote, much bigger abusers than others. Again, not my field, but this is how I understand it after my own research. Tariffs are paid by the producer based on the transaction value to the import country, aka the value declared to US Customs and Border Protection on import. It is not based on MSRP, which the consumer pays. This is sometimes known as a first sale value. So, for example, if an entire Switch 2 unit, packaging and all, is created on foreign soil and then sold to the GameStop that it is imported to, the tariff is based on that sale value that GameStop purchased the foreign Switch 2 unit for, not the price tag the consumer pays from GameStop's shelf. If the declared value of this item on customs is $10 and there exists a $10 tariff to bring it into the country, then $1 is being paid to the government to import that item. Then maybe it's sold to the consumer for $21 instead of $20 that it may have been sold at without a tariff. This applies even if you are shipping something to yourself. So if Nintendo sends game cartridges to Nintendo in Washington to be packaged and shipped to the actual sellers, they are still required to pay the tariff on the value of that cartridge on import. So to clarify, they are not paying a US import tariff on the full package game, but rather just the cartridges, as the packaging seems to be done in Washington state. Though if the materials used in said packaging come from abroad, then that packaging material will indeed also be tariffed. This had me wondering what's stopping them from declaring the value of their cartridges as something like $1 and arguing it's only worth $80 when it's surrounded in packaging. But if you have suspiciously low value declared, then chances are you're getting audited or tariffed even harder by the US Customs and Border Protection, who will review documentation relating to production and challenge your low valuation. Producers are required to keep documentation pertaining to the production of the item in question to justify its value, which may need to be presented to customs. And if you're shipping game cartridges, you better be including the production of that software on the cartridge, aka something that drastically increases the value of the cartridge, into your determination of the cartridge's value. It's generally the best practice to be careful and truthful rather than testing your luck with the US government. So, is Nintendo taking a massive hit to their physical game sales because of US tariffs? Well, probably. There is one workaround they could do. If they ship the cartridges to the US blank, and then it's within the US that game software is installed onto the cartridge, then the tariff they're paying is on the value of a blank cartridge of X size, not a game cartridge, as it only becomes a game cartridge within US borders. You can't tariff digital software, so have the digital software and the physical hardware travel separately, and then have them only be combined on US soil. This is something we see something similar to in the automotive sector in the form of KD. No, not craft dinner. No, not your kill-death ratio, but knockdown kits. These are partially assembled vehicle components which will be assembled in their destination country, so tariffs are paid on the value of partially assembled vehicle components, rather than paying tariffs on the value of a fully assembled vehicle. Well, at least in some countries. The Trump administration decided there wasn't going to be exceptions for knockdown kits, so tariff-wise they're treated as if they are fully assembled vehicles in the US. Empty cartridges could be Nintendo's knockdown kits. There's nothing on them until it's installed, possibly at the packaging facility, applying tariffs to empty cartridges with much less value than game cartridges. I would imagine one could make the argument that a blank cartridge isn't worth much more than the manufacturing cost, whereas a game cartridge is something that actually has real sale value as something consumers would want. Not saying that I'm a corporation trying to find ways to sneak out of having to pay the US government as much, but if I was, that's how I'd do it. There don't appear to be any records of Nintendo adopting such an approach, and realistically though, I don't think it makes much sense for them to do so anyway if they don't already have a setup to do that. As far as I can tell, the world does not seem happy with current US economic policy with tariffs, and neither are many Americans, even within the Republican Party. So let's say you spend 2 to 3 years developing the facilities to install software onto cartridges within the US, and rework your whole network and increase expenses by shipping cartridges to this facility to be processed, and then sent to the packaging facility from there. This is the new production network you've finished as of maybe 2027 to account for Trump's tariffs, bringing more of the production process onto American soil like Trump wants. Then all of a sudden in 2028, new leadership is elected to power, which intends on doing away with all these Trump administration tariffs at the start of their term in 2029. Well, now you've redone your production network and created new infrastructure you don't even need anymore. What a waste. And you might not even need to wait until 2028 to find out it was all a waste, as we see the live screening of the Orange Karate Kid practicing his signature tax on, tax off. Tariffs are being put on and taken off again wildly. The tariff situation may look completely different now than it does next week, so that the felon and his billionaire buddies can continue to grow their fortunes by taking from the common people by using insider trading. Allegedly. So even if everywhere is getting tariffed to bring more production onto American soil, any company worth their salt won't. If you invest in creating greater production in the US, you're essentially playing a roulette for if that facility is going to matter during any point in the Trump administration's time in office, and chances are the wheel is going to be taken away and your remaining chips on the board are losses by 2029 anyway. Well, unless we just decide to ignore the 22nd Amendment. Companies don't want to be taking this kind of gamble. In the gaming industry, for example, we see companies that continue to play proven successful options over creating something completely new. Why reinvent the wheel when we can just pump out another Call of Duty, Assassin's Creed, or Pokemon? Why take a risk on something that could be a crazy new successful brand or a major failure and loss, when we can instead just continue putting out something that will continue to be pretty successful no matter what? With the insanely high degree of safety so many gaming companies already take, is it really realistic to expect them to take such a major gamble on the value of increasing their production within the US? No. What's realistic within this environment of back and forth, tax on, tax off, that we'll most likely only be seeing for the next 4 years at most anyway, is to just eat the tariff and ride it out. So, Switch 2 units and game cartridges are being produced abroad, are imported to the US, and eat the tariff. We don't have super accurate estimates on the cost to manufacture a Switch 2 yet, as Nintendo didn't release the specs, and the console only just released the day that I scheduled this video to go public. However, we can use the Switch 1 as a more accurate example, as we have estimates on its production costs that are based on actually taking and dismantling a thing. The Japanese teardown firm Fomohaut Techno Solutions estimated in 2017 that it costs roughly $257 for each Switch that rolls off the assembly line. At that value, you've got a little bit of margin for shipping and middleman markup. Probably little, if any, profit. That's common by console manufacturers. Consoles are not often sold with the intention of explicit profit. You make the console easier to afford to get it into more households, and then the greater number of consumers with your consoles means you're now selling more games you actually generate revenue on. It's why the Costco hot dog has had its price be unchanged after all these years. You don't make profit off of that hot dog, but by selling it at such an affordable price, it brings people in that are purchasing your groceries that you do make profit off of. Same deal with consoles. Sometimes they're sold for profit, but probably very little if any, and a lot of the time can be sold for a loss. But now we're dealing with tariffs. Let's say this Switch unit was produced in China for a declared value of $257, but they're dealing with the 145% tariff on China that was going on during Trump and Xi Jinping's most expensive game of chicken. That means in addition to the $257 in cost to make that console, you need to pay the US government $372.67, bringing in the total cost of making and bringing that unit into the US to $629.65, more than double the MSRP of $299. Yeah, if tariffs get into absurd numbers like that, it's safe to assume that most trade is just off the table. It's not gonna be profitable. I'll bet Nintendo breathed quite the sigh of relief when reflecting on their decision to be moving production to Vietnam around 2019. Not too heavy of a sigh, though. Vietnam's under a 46% tariff, or at least supposedly will be after the 90-day pause is done. So let's say we're importing a $257 Switch from Vietnam. That's $118.22 paid to US Customs on import, bringing the total cost of producing and importing that Switch unit to the US to $375.22 before shipping. The unit that, again, is going to be sold by the middleman at $299, which you sold to them for less than that so they can get their own markup. During the 90-day pause happening during the making of this video, Vietnam is under the default 10% tariff. This would mean US Customs would take $25.70 for that $257 Switch import, bringing the total cost of that unit to $282.70 before shipping. If the Switch 1 is being sold to retailers for, say, $270, giving the retailer a $29 markup, even under the 10% tariffs, you are selling that console at a loss. Again, it's not uncommon for game consoles to be sold at a loss. That is made up in game sales. But for some of these higher tariffs, that loss per console really adds up. What about the cost of the Switch 2? We don't have anything more concrete yet, but there have been estimates that it may cost roughly $400 USD to produce, so that's the number we're going to estimate based off of. It's probably not, but for the sake of curiosity, if it was made in China with a 145% tariff, that would mean an import cost of $580, bringing the total cost to $980 for this console that will be sold to consumers for $449. If made in Vietnam after the 90-day pause, 46% tariff means $184 import fees, or a total of $584 on this console that will be sold to consumers for $449. If made in Vietnam during the 90-day pause and subject to the 10% standard tariff, that is a $40 import fee, bringing the total cost to $440. For the console that will be sold to consumers for $449. We do need to account for retailer markup. We need to sell the console to retailers for cheaper to make it worth their while to sell them. So let's say the wholesale price to retailers is $420 per unit, so retailers make $29 on console sales. Yeah, all of these are still at a loss. And frankly, I have no idea what the retailer markup for consoles typically is. I'm making an assumption that it's rather small so that I'm not cherry-picking extremes. What about for the games? Assuming they are actually a programmed game cartridge with intellectual property on it and not just a blank piece of plastic with memory, we're paying the tariff on the value of that cartridge, aka not just the manufacturing cost of it. Again, we're assuming all packaging material is developed in the US to package cartridges in Washington, so the only thing being imported is the cartridges themselves. Time to do a whole bunch of guessing because, again, the only ones that truly know are Nintendo. If a game is being sold for $70 or $80, let's say those are being sold wholesale to retailers for $60 or $70 respectively. On the customs form, Nintendo may be declaring the value of the individual cartridges as maybe $40 or $50, then when packaged they gain $20 value or some such. If we declare on US customs that the value of the game cartridges we're importing is $40 or $50-ish, the corresponding tariff cost will be as follows. I don't have a clue what the cartridge manufacturing cost is, so because I'd just be wildly guessing otherwise anyway, let's assume that Nate Drake Tingle is right and a chunkier Switch 1 cartridge at 32GB is about $14, since with the Switch 2, as games are getting bigger, many games will be finding that 16GB is not enough. I'm going to blatantly steal this image from my Discord server to make it appear like I made it, which shows us that Mario Kart World, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom would all need at least the 32GB cartridges anyway. Wait, why is Breath of the Wild so chunky now anyway? Shipping costs in the Americas would be from either Japan or Vietnam to Washington, and then from Washington across the Americas to retailers. Though we are shipping in bulk, I don't know, $4 a unit overall. Packaging, I don't know, let's say $1.50 per unit for the whole process. Let me emphasize again, the only ones that actually know the overhead costs are Nintendo. This is just me crunching some numbers that sound like they might give us a general idea of what's going on here. This brings our total cost to the following. But now we're selling these games to retailers for say $60 or $70 depending on the game, so they can get $10 of their own profit. This brings our total profits for each individual physical game sale to be roughly the following. As you can see, if you're manufacturing in China while Trump had his 145% tariff active, if you want to earn profit on physical game sales in the US, either you better jack up that price, or you just don't sell in the US. Sell the units that already exist there, and if there's a shortage, then that's too bad. Push consumers more to digital, I guess. Wait for the tariffs to go away before you import your additional inventory. Maybe we get a black market of foreign Switch games starting. If we're manufacturing in Vietnam under a 46% or 10% tariff, chances are we are indeed making profit, but we are making a substantial difference in profit the less tariffs there are. If we decide to follow in the path of the legendary hot dog and keep the price the same at $60 instead after all, but our cartridges are being produced in Vietnam under a 46% tariff, and these numbers are at least somewhat on the money, yeah, that's maybe $10 a profit per game sale, though more profit if we're manufacturing on smaller cartridges. I'm sure some games could still turn a profit relative to their production costs at that valuation. I don't know how much was put into Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, but after 26.38 million units sold, if each was on an expensive chonking cartridge going through 46% tariffs because every single one of those sales was in the US alone at a meager $10 profit per game, and every single game sale was physical alone, that is still 263.8 million in profit. There's absolutely no shot that's not profitable with whatever budget this abomination had. But not every game is going to be like that, and $10 profit per physical game sale in the US, I would imagine, is probably really not that much. Also worth knowing that these tariffs don't just directly affect the US, but directly affect the Americas as a whole. Remember, it seems that cartridges come into the US, therefore being subject to US tariffs, to be packaged and shipped out to retailers across the Americas. This means that as Canadians, we too need to pay the US import tariffs on Switch games because they have to go through the US to reach us. Now, here I am paying over $100 Canadian for games at the lower end. Yeah, after taxes, one of these guys is not going to cut it anymore. That's not a great feeling. I would imagine that Nintendo gave themselves an extra buffer with the prices to account for the hit they take to profits in the Americas due to tariffs, but clearly wasn't expecting anything as large as 46%, which led to them postponing pre-orders while they reconsidered prices. They eventually announced the price of their console remaining the same, despite it very likely now being produced at a loss, and the cost of their games would remain the same, but the price of their accessories would increase. I have no doubt my numbers are nowhere near the bullseye, but if they're at least on the right dartboard, then even with a 46% tariff, games should still be profitable, just nowhere near as much as if they weren't being tariffed. The backlash to the game prices was already biblical, so it likely is a smart move to leave them as is, but increase accessories to compensate some for their tariff losses, which also likely means increased costs in Canada due to passing through the US to be packaged. I say likely because I don't think the pre-tariff Canadian prices were ever announced. Such is how it goes. Increased cost on the producer typically means increased cost on the consumer. Just bump my microphone again. This is something Microsoft decided to act on as well. The beginning of May 2025, Microsoft announced their Xbox consoles, accessories, and new games would be adopting a major price hike and adopting $80 USD as the new standard price for new games. It will be interesting to see what Sony decides, though they're currently in hot water from fans for having next to no console exclusives, and for their PS5 Pro, most feel is a marginal difference to a base PS5 with a greatly elevated cost. That thing is nearly $1,000 Canadian in my country. I could buy a whole one university class for that. Alright, let's checkpoint here again. To recap, in terms of the changing purchasing power with inflation, prices are either the same or cheaper than ever. Meanwhile, the overhead costs are being elevated by depreciating yen, elevated manufacturing and production costs as we produce for more powerful hardware, elevated cost of goods in general in a recently post-COVID world, which is correlated with inflation, the destabilization of the world economy as much of the world has new priorities on excluding what were once the two superpowers of the world of the US and Russia, and the tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. Is it a good thing that the dollar number on the price tag is going up? No, especially in a struggling economy where things are getting more difficult to afford. I'm not trying to be here like, leave the multi-billion-dollar company alone! Frankly, I rather despise Nintendo as a company. So no, it's not good, and for consumers it is likely getting less affordable. But is it surprising? No. Is Nintendo reaching a new level of pure unfiltered greed like so many YouTubers would turn on their camera to tell you? No. And yet, this is what it felt like everyone and their mother was saying on social media. It's so easy to just consider the factors we know are involved and assign blame based on that face value, all while being ignorant to the true factors. And I get it. It's hard to do thorough research, especially in regards to matters that the company in question is not going to be discussing publicly. And this video that I thought would be a quick 20 to 30 minutes explaining everything has become well over an hour and taken longer than I care to admit to make. Look, I'm wearing another shirt because it's another day again. And I get that there's who want nothing about economics or politics involved in the sphere of this hobby that they're passionate about. But the truth is, like all other media entertainment, like it or not, it is an integral part of gaming. What are the conditions of the market? What are the effects of inflation? What content is allowed within the game? What is seen as socially acceptable within the game? What political arguments is the game trying to make, or inadvertently making, and so much more. Like, remember when Skull and Bones still had to come out due to a deal with the Singaporean government? I would argue it's simply not possible to separate politics and gaming into wholly separate entities. In my own opinion, if you are not taking into consideration these integral pieces on the board, then you don't have the framework for an argument on the prices, because then you are making an argument from negligence. Like I was during the Switch 2 reveal presentation, and I heard that prices were increased in the US, and I made an assumption that this was just due to tariffs and it was only a price increase in the US. My argument was negligent. That importance on having a framework for your argument goes especially for influencers, who I'd argue we see a misuse of the platform of by not doing the due diligence that's expected of them as influencers with the power to shape the decisions of others. Outrage over the prices seemed to lead to this desperate confirmation bias where individuals sought out whatever information supported the narrative they had constructed in an attempt for validation. You have cases where someone either wouldn't do due diligence or would explicitly lie by coming to a false conclusion, and preach that false conclusion, which supports the narrative that validates the viewpoint others have, so they latch on, assuming that the person they got the information from did their due diligence, or the person they got information from did due diligence. There's this level of trust put on strangers on the internet, which, has your experience on the internet told you that strangers are trustworthy?
You really think someone would do that? Just go on the internet and tell lies?
The biggest example of this for Switch 2 was in regards to the game cartridges being key cards. It spread like wildfire, with even some very large YouTubers preaching that the games weren't even on the cartridges. They're all game key cards.
Wait, it's all game key cards? Always has been.
Yeah, this is false. The source being the actual page for game key cards, if anybody actually bothered to read it. The very first sentence of the page is, game key cards are different from regular game cards, aka these are not regular game cards, logically implying the existence of regular game cards. At least that used to be the first sentence of the page, now it's the second. As I found out while writing this script, they've added a new first sentence to make the intent even clearer, likely in response to them getting backlash about something that wasn't even true. The new first sentence reads, Nintendo Switch 2 supports both regular game cards and game key cards, explicitly telling you, yes, both these things exist. And it seems like they added another new sentence while I was in the middle of editing this video to make the intent as crystal clear as it can get. Now following that sentence, it also says, some games will use game key cards, while others will continue to use regular game cards, to make it as clear as possible. The last sentence before the first image reads, here's what game keycard packaging looks like, aka here's how you tell them apart from regular packaging. So if you just read the actual page being cited, even before the new first sentence, I feel it should have been fairly obvious that this is not the norm. This is just an option on the table now for potential publishers on the platform. But before you knew it, these game keycards were trending on social media with people saying that the data wasn't even on cartridges anymore. The Switch 2 console is overpriced. Well, I mean, wait for it to release, and which I guess has already happened at the time this video is published, I'm remembering, and then teardown analysis can give us a much more accurate estimate on the rough manufacturing cost. Plus, we also have to consider factors like tariffs, and then we can come to a conclusion on whether its price point is appropriate. They just invented Discord. There's no reason to use this over Discord. Okay, what? You can chat on the other consoles too. Did Microsoft and Sony also invent Discord? The Switch 1 voice chat solution was them inventing Discord, as you had to use an external app to use I don't know what hell I just dropped. As you had to use an external app to use Nintendo's voice chat service. So if you're already using an external app anyway, why wouldn't you use the one that you're already more comfortable with? With Switch 2, it's actually integrated, adding a greater level of convenience than needing to use an external app and multiple devices.
If you wanna go, then you go to hill and go down.
Why you get
Okay,
fried,
yes,
man?
why? Are you crazy?
You're fucking paranoid,
You are
man.
fucking, you are fucking.
You fucking, you bloody,
You bloody.
fuck you bloody, bastard bitch,
You
fuck you,
bastard,
fuck
you.
you.
There's also features like the screen sharing that you can't do on Discord for console games under normal circumstances. I can share my Switch gameplay through Discord if I want, but that's because I have a capture card that those who aren't content creators probably won't. I have the right software, and I have the know-how to use the proper plugins that allow me to properly cast to Discord streaming. But this is not something the average user will be able to do. Plus, there's the convenience of it all being on one screen ahead of you, as opposed to set across multiple displays, as would be the case if I shared my gameplay with friends and they to me through Discord on a console. In regards to the stream frame rate, there's a limited amount of resources on a console. Game takes some, there's less for streaming. Stream takes some, there's less for game. There's a balance that you have to strike here. Do we add more oomph, and now the console is more expensive, which consumers already complained about the price, and if we did, then why not use that more oomph to make the games even better? But now we're in the same situation again with the streaming. Personally, I don't mind the approach they took of the game I'm playing still being silky smooth, while my friends' screens are a little choppy, because my game is the one I'm actually looking at, whereas theirs is more so side vision, occasional glance. I only really want a general idea of what's going on. If it's still that choppy if you pull it up in full screen, where your game shouldn't be eating up that much resources anymore in this idle state, then I'll definitely have an issue. After the Switch 2 Direct presentation, I saw a lot going around. Nintendo is greedier than ever with these prices. The games aren't even on their cartridges anymore. They just invented Discord. There's no reason to use it over Discord. Look, I really do not like Nintendo as a company. Anyone that's been around this channel for a while knows that, so I am all for criticizing them. But even more than that, I am for informed arguments. So when I see these echo chambers arguing from negligence, I can't help but find it frustrating. If you want to criticize the price of new games in an informed manner, then make arguments such as Sony has the $70 standard, while Xbox just recently updated to the $80 standard. Nintendo should keep their prices the same to remain competitive. Due to the increased cost of living and difficulty affording luxuries such as games, Nintendo should keep the prices the same so more consumers can afford these games, gaining more sales. Variable pricing is based off of the amount of content in the game? Is that not just a corporate blanket statement to charge more for the games they know will be the most in demand? Or so on. And realistically speaking, while I believe those on social media calling for boycotts of Nintendo are a vocal minority, let's say there actually was a significant movement boycotting Nintendo and pressuring them to make cheaper products. That's not a bad thing. More affordable video games are a win for the consumer. And I do believe there exists a fair amount of content Nintendo puts out that consumers should really be taking a harder look at and asking themselves, is this really worth the price? On that note, there are some regards to Switch 2 prices that I will absolutely criticize myself. I've tried to have much of the video before this point be more objective and less opinionated. Full disclosure, as I discuss my own issues I take, this is going to now be more opinionated and less objective. So, you're telling me, all these games are getting free performance updates, but on Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, it's paid only? Well, that's because there's new content added into, not it, but an external app. You can see Zelda's notes, which will give you some of Zelda's comments about the area, which I'm sure you can Google all of once this releases anyway. It'll just let you immediately see them while you're there. So essentially, you're paying for convenience. It saves you a search. You're given an interactive map that shows you objectives, something that's been made freely available online for years. Nintendo has begun selling you time saver packs like Ubisoft. The only real advantage over existing maps online is that it shows you your current location and can vocally tell you the direction to go to save you an occasional glance at the phone, I guess.
You wanna go, then you go to hill and go down.
But wait, if this is directly communicating with the game anyway to show your current location, why wouldn't this update just, update the in-game map? Why does it only label an external map your game is connected to? I take back my earlier comment about it being like a Ubisoft Time Saver pack. It's worse than a Ubisoft Time Saver pack. A Ubisoft Time Saver pack updates your map in-game, not give you a complete map you can check out on your phone. There's no way to get just the performance boost without also purchasing this external app content. It's all part of the upgrade pack. Do you know what this is? It's an excuse to make more revenue off of Breath of the Wild again. Consumers love Breath of the Wild, where 2 mainline games, 2 spin-offs, 2 DLC expansions, and now 2 upgrade packs into this Breath of the Wild train, which isn't stopping anytime soon. Whether you like the game or not, it can't be denied Breath of the Wild was a market success. Nintendo clearly wants to ride that money train further, but how do we monetize the performance enhancements? Oh, let's use the same strategy we used to justify the price of our online subscriptions. Random extra bullshit barely anyone will even use, but it's all a bundle, so you can't buy these things individually. What I find really funny as well is that this is something included under their premium subscription. As long as you're subscribed, you'll have access to the Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom performance enhancements. So let's say one day you're playing at 60 FPS, but the next day your subscription expires. Money is tight and it's hard to keep affording it after all. Nintendo then says, "What? You stopped giving us subscription money? Back to 30 FPS, peasant." It makes me think of those cars that have heated seat subscriptions. Like, the capabilities are there in the machine that you paid for, but they'll only be usable if you're actively paying for the subscription. The prices of their Nintendo Switch 2 edition games are, well, Mr. Funny Man, is this how you get your sick kicks? What? It's just an ordinary enhanced port. Oh my goodness! Why is this what is, as far as I can tell, their premium game price and not even the new standard game price? Sure, like I said, when you account for inflation, Breath of the Wild now at $70 is cheaper than it was at $60 in 2017. Tears of the Kingdom, however, is more expensive than its launch year of 2023. But you can still buy Breath of the Wild on the Switch today for its same standard $60, which also hasn't dropped because Nintendo doesn't drop their prices outside of specific sale events, which is its own whole can of worms. I would argue if you need to account for inflation in the gaming industry, do so in the future with new games you put out, not increase the price of an 8-year-old game. It's 8 years old! Breath of the Wild could be starting 3rd grade by now! If anything, it should be discounted at this point. Nintendo did a lot of enhanced ports from Wii U to Switch, but these were the same number price, so even cheaper when accounting for inflation, and with new content added into them to make them the definitive experience. Breath of the Wild Switch 2 edition, meanwhile, costs $70 to play the 8-year-old game with the performance enhancements, and the new content of the smartphone app. It doesn't even come with Breath of the Wild's DLC. If we followed the formula of Nintendo's Wii U to Switch games, this would have released as an enhanced port, with previous DLC and new enhancements or content built in for the price the original release was at. Instead, we are releasing the same game with enhancements and a questionable amount of new content for a more expensive price, and DLC that was released 8 years ago itself is still a separate purchase. And that's not even the worst part. Breath of the Wild Nintendo Switch 2 edition actually costs more than it costs to buy Breath of the Wild and the Switch 2 upgrade. At least here in Canada, where it's cheaper by $5. In the US, it's cheaper by a penny. You know, I was so fixated on Breath of the Wild during the making of this video, what with it being the older one, that I didn't even notice at the time that Tears of the Kingdom is $10 more expensive for Switch 2 edition in Canada than just buying the Switch 1 edition and the upgrade pack. I think I have a game I'd like to recommend Nintendo. It's called Brain Age Academy. Were they on some super mushrooms or something when they designed the prices for Canada? Or even the US too, honestly. When you purchase something as a bundle, it should be expected that it is cheaper than the sum of its parts. You are buying a bundle. Switch 2 MSRP in the US is $450, while the Mario Kart World bundle is $500, and Mario Kart World individually is $80. Imagine if the Mario Kart World bundle cost $530, or $535 USD in Canada, because I guess Nintendo doesn't like Canadians for some reason. What would be the point of buying the bundle when you're paying either the same or even more than the sum of its parts? Its existence is near meaningless in that case. What you're paying for is a box that looks a little different. You don't have to allocate space on your own console storage for that update, I would presume, unless you're doing like a BDSP thing. And in the far future, after the servers are taken down and you can't download the upgrade anymore if you don't already have it, that cartridge will have more sale value. You're welcome for those perks, says Nintendo. That's why we're charging you more. Look, I've generally had fun playing Breath of the Wild. I generally had fun playing Tears of the Kingdom. I surprisingly quite enjoyed Age of Calamity after it exceeded my expectations. I have my fair share of complaints with these games, but I generally liked them and felt they were worth the cost of entry. But I think after Breath of the Wild's insane success that Nintendo was pushing this way too far. Pay for the enhancements that are free in our other games, just because these enhancements are bundled with a smartphone app you'll probably never use to justify the price. We're charging a new premium for this 8-year-old game that isn't actually getting any new content in-game. The Switch 2 edition of this game is more expensive than buying a Switch 1 copy of it and purchasing the enhancements. We're releasing a new prequel to the sequel. I liked Age of Calamity. I'm sure I'll like this game, but for real, who actually wanted a game to tell the story of what led into Tears of the Kingdom? I can't be the only one getting sick and tired of the Breath of the Wild saga by now. It feels very much like they are trying to milk the Breath of the Wild craze for all it's worth, and frankly, I'm at the point where I'm grossed out by this. Nintendo Switch 2 Welcome Tours paid software being listed at $10 USD. I think it's important to have something you can do with your console out of the box, rather than just being a useless hunk of parts and UI you can display. When I bought the Switch 1 on a release day after waiting in line for 10 hours, I didn't purchase any games there because I had ordered them on Amazon. Back then, Amazon actually had good deals for gamers, where if you were a Prime member, you had 20% off the purchase of new games, so I purchased my games through Amazon. So when I got home and I got my console set up, there was nothing I could do with it, especially since it didn't have an internet browser and it didn't have a YouTube app or anything like that at the time. So it just sat on my desk as a useless hunk of parts all I could do was look at. Consumers could be in situations like mine, or maybe you just can't afford any games yet, especially in today's economy as we discussed. You should still be able to do something with your console instead of it just being useless. The Wii had Wii Sports, which became an integral part of the Wii's identity, and I would argue earned a significant place in video game history. You had this fun game out of the box that showcased the uniqueness of the console, and allowed you to play simple and fun games in multiplayer up to 4 people. It even spawned a follow-up with Wii Sports Resort, and maybe something else too, but nobody remembers. The Wii U had Nintendo Land, which served as a showcase for Nintendo's different IPs, while having a mix of single-player games, multiplayer versus games, and multiplayer co-op games. I remember if we had company over and we wanted to play some Wii U, we'd be putting in Nintendo Land. The games were fun and actually used the Wii U gamepad in unique ways I saw very few other games even attempt to do. Not only with the Wii and Wii U did you have a game to play right out of the box, but they were actual great games that would keep you coming back. This is something that we see on PlayStation 5 as well with Astro's Playroom, where you're given a fun out-of-the-box game to play that is directly connected to the PlayStation 5 as you're running around in a PlayStation 5 here, and was fun enough to spawn another follow-up game like Wii Sports Resort to Wii Sports, that was received so well that it became Game of the Year. The Switch and Switch 2 don't have anything out of the box, so when you buy a console, there's nothing you can do until you purchase a game, unless you purchase the Mario Kart World Bundle for Switch 1 or Switch 2. The game that served as a multiplayer foray into some of the console's capabilities was 1-2 Switch. I own this game. It's fun for like 10 minutes, and then it's just that weird thing that you never really want to play again unless it's done ironically with friends. Quick Draw and Sword Fight are pretty fun. Most of them, I think, serve more to showcase console capabilities rather than being something I'd actually consider fun, and a lot of these console capabilities would pretty much never be used by any other games. With Switch 2, our equivalent starter game is Nintendo Switch 2 Welcome Tour, implying it's bundled in when it's not. It doesn't look like something I would consider fun either, more of an exploration of what your console is capable of through walls of text, and minigame demonstrations that I imagine will feel like 1-2 Switch, and that it's more so just showing you what the console can do, rather than being an actual fun game. Despite the fact that Wii Sports and Nintendo Land had both fun and console demonstration intertwined in a great way. So if it's more just informative, why wouldn't you have this be something just bundled in? Because 1, then there's something to interact with out of the box, and 2, it serves as something to get consumers excited about this console they just purchased. They learn all these things about the hardware, all these things this console is capable of, getting them excited to really delve into it and purchase some games. So even from a business standpoint, I think it is an incredibly poor decision not to bundle in this software with a console, as now you're missing out on this excitement and motivation for purchasing games. You want consumers purchasing your games, so why wouldn't you want to get them excited for that prospect by bundling this in? Ugh. The C button, GameChat and GameShare. I think that needing to pay to play games online is the biggest ripoff in the console gaming industry that's become normalized after the other consoles followed Xbox's suit. I purchased this multiplayer game. You're telling me I can't play it multiplayer on the internet unless I'm regularly giving you money? Yes, servers cost money to run, but I as a consumer would expect that my purchase of this game counts as my contribution to said server costs. I honestly like the idea of GameChat and GameShare, as I mentioned before, for the convenience of being able to show my games to others. What I don't like is that this, what appears to be central feature of the console, is subscription exclusive. If you're not shelling out, well, this button is just useless. Don't have friends to game chat with? Well, this useless button will serve as an eternal reminder. Significant time has passed and the Switch servers aren't around anymore? Guess this button will just never do anything again, simply a relic of the past. If you can respec this button for custom controls, then great, but I wouldn't expect that to be the case. Nintendo's entire stance toward their classic games, because every console needs its own subscription service now. You're telling me these games are decades old, and the only way you'll let me play them is by renting your library through a subscription model? I've talked about these on previous video essays, so let's take this swiftly and go through all the issues this presents. 1. You can never own these games. If your subscription expires, you can't play anymore until you resubscribe. The day the servers go down, I presume these are all gone forever, or moved over to a future console that maybe you have to purchase to be able to continue playing. 2. There is no option to simply pay for one thing you want to play. You need to pay to rent the entire library. 3. There is no option to purchase these games outside of shelling out hundreds online for original hardware and software, essentially forcing consumers to choose the subscription as the most cost-effective option by exerting the subscription monopoly on the Nintendo classic games market. 4. Everything is bundled together to inflate value, even if there's only one thing or one console of games you actually want. Just want to play games online? Whoops, guess you're paying for NES and SNES games too that are used to inflate the value. It's not just online you're getting, it's these classic games too. Well, surely that helps justify the price, even if you never touch a single NES or SNES game. 5. Library content can change. Games may be removed as licenses expire. It seems rare in the case of Nintendo's subscription, but it has already happened before and it will happen again. There's no guarantee that game you just played will continue to be available there, something you wouldn't have to worry about if you owned. And 6, and there's a bit of explanation to this point. The libraries are kept purposefully barren. There are currently 34 Nintendo 64 games available for the Switch. There were 388 Nintendo 64 games. Nintendo Classics covers 8.76% of the Nintendo 64 library. There are currently 24 Game Boy Advance games on Nintendo Classics. There were 1,538 Game Boy Advance games. Nintendo Classics covers 1.56% of the total Game Boy Advance library. There will be 3 GameCube games available on Nintendo Classics with the Switch 2's launch, with 7 more confirmed for a later date so far. There were 651 GameCube games. The freaking Nintendo Classics will cover 0.46% of the GameCube library at launch, but that is confirmed to eventually increase to at least 1.54% at a later date. This is done for 2 reasons, both of which stem from the idea of increasing demand by decreasing supply. The first is so they can continue to advertise their subscription service nearly every direct as they put out more games. Why make your total plan library available from the beginning for a big launch, but then relying on word of mouth for the most part to be spread from there, when you can instead begin lackluster and add very slowly over time so that every time you add is a reminder to Nintendo players that this service exists, and these specific games are now available. It spends more time in the consumer consciousness than it would otherwise, driving up interest. The second reason is so that they can get away with full-price enhanced ports or half-assed remasters. What are you gonna do, buy the original consoles and games? In this market? In this economy? Why would you pay some inflated price for a classic game when you can just get it on the subscription? Well, it's not available on the subscription, and there's no way to know if it ever will be. So the full-priced half-baked port/remaster remains your most cost-effective option. If Nintendo preaches that here's the only way to play these games on this console, so you purchase it, but then just releases them on their subscription later anyway. Oops, I guess that's another victim of the Nintendo double dip. So all in all, I think that Nintendo's subscription model is terrible, and what I would argue is the most anti-consumer thing they do today, that it feels like nobody really talks about. It's been rolled out slowly enough that it was accepted by the frog boiling in water. And I know that despite covering mostly Nintendo games on my channel, even if this channel somehow ever blew up, there's no shot they'd ever work with me because I refuse to ever shell out for their premium subscription scam instead of just playing classic games through other means. Please don't sue me. Alright, but that's enough of that. It is time to tie this all together with a little bow. Prices are not increasing relative to purchasing power. However, video games are likely getting more difficult to afford for many consumers in this economy. There's many contributing factors to the increased prices, which I would argue likely actually lead to a smaller profit margin than seen on the Switch. So the standard game price, I feel like, is not some whole new level of greed like the bandwagon has been jumped on, instead being pretty par for the course and not unexpected. However, I feel there are things that absolutely are being overcharged for, and decisions that don't even make sense from the perspective of a company trying to maximize their profits. In short, it's complicated. It's not so black and white. I hope this video was able to help you get a better sense for what this landscape looks like, and that whatever stance you take, you can take it from a place of being informed. If you have any corrections for me, please let me know because, again, not my field. If you want to get a Switch 2, go for it. If you don't want to get a Switch 2, fair enough, don't. I don't care. If someone wanted to get into gaming and wanted recommendations on which platform they should choose, honestly, I would personally recommend PC. I'll be picking up a Switch 2 and doing playthroughs and tournaments of the big releases, which you'll be able to find on this channel over the coming years. Check out some of my playthroughs here if you want to see what some of these games are like. Or don't, I can't tell you what to do. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all my Patreon supporters, Emerald Finder, for helping make this video possible. Anyway, that's all I've got. Watch them charge $60 for Pokemon Legends ZA, and then $80 for Pokemon Legends ZA Switch 2 Edition. Also, you can see those ugly, flat, textured buildings so much more clearly than you could otherwise.